bit about my sort of the origin of my interest in this topic, and then what we'll talk about today. And so I think, that interest was really piqued by the annual struggle we have in analyzing recruits to the medicine program here, where I would say about 5 to 10 applicants per year. We have a sort of heated debate amongst our group. Is this a skillfully written bad letter? This is intentionally written to cast doubt on the candidate, or this is a poorly written good letter. This is meant to advocate for the candidate, but is just so poorly written as to sort of like be uninterpretable. Obviously, we're going to do really different things with those. And, talking to colleagues in the IME, this is sort of a discussion, a challenge across sort of the entire sort of GME spectrum of how we sort of interpret these letters. And I think the fear was maybe we are inadvertently doing this to, our students here or our residents here or our fellows here. We're not writing the best possible letters. And so, just looking through who is here, I think we have a lot of collective expertise. I think collectively we've probably written, thousands of letters. And so hopefully we can all leave with a little something today in our roles as teachers and mentors, a little more about how to be sort of effective advocates for our trainees. Maybe not writing the best possible letter, but writing the most effective letter. Ways that we can all sort of mitigate and reduce bias, whether that's sort of racial bias, gender bias that may creep into our letters, and be mindful of that. And then last but not least, a sort of bigger task, how we as sort of an educational community make sure that these letters have value. And we'll talk about how maybe they don't right now because of sort of widespread recommendation inflation. And so I have no conflicts to disclose. And so my sort of aim is sort of fourfold. So talk a little bit about how program directors use these letters from what we can tell, the difference between standardized and narrative letters, some data we have that informs what characteristics, phrases, elements are important in these letters, and then leave you with a little bit of a framework for how to write these based on sort of best practices from the literature. My talk will skew pretty heavily towards writing letters for students applying to residency, residents applying for fellowship, mostly because that's where the data is. I would argue what I say holds true for any kind of letter, writing for junior faculty, for awards, for graduate students applying for programs. I think these lessons hold true across the entire spectrum of trainees. And so let's sort of jump in by thinking a little bit about how these letters are used so we can contextualize what we're trying to accomplish by writing a letter. Just looking across Mount Sinai, for residency programs, pretty standard. Almost every residency program insists on at least 3 letters, OB-GYN 4, and then a couple programs want so-called standardized letters of recommendation, which we'll talk about as an attempt to create a more readable, more easy to interpret letter. And so the question is, how are programs using these? And through the NRMP, the matching program, they survey program directors so we can get some sense of how they use letters of recommendation to inform their decisions to both invite applicants for interview and to subsequently rank them. And so from the 2020 program director survey, you can see that on this left-hand side, sort of the green is the percent of program directors who felt that element was important. And then on the right-hand side is a 1 to 5 score on how important it was, assuming they did find it valuable. And so 84% of program directors thought letters of recommendation, either sort of a chair letter or the narrative letters, were valuable in deciding who to interview. And then kind of right in the middle, I don't think it's any more or less important than other factors. So kind of consider with other factors, but after step 1 was the second most highly cited element in deciding who to interview for training programs. And this is across the entire GME spectrum. When you look at the separate question of how they use letters to decide to rank applicants, you can see that it's falling in importance. So most program directors consider letters in deciding who to interview. Fewer consider them and who to rank highly for their program. And other factors have become much more important after the interview. And so I don't think this is necessarily surprising that you may rely on someone's outside opinion on the characteristics of a trainee when you haven't met them yet. But once you've interviewed them, you're likely going to rely on your interactions with that applicant during the day as the most crucial features of how you're going to sort of rank someone. And so already we're getting the sense that letters are a good way to sort of like put your foot in the door to help the trainee get that interview, but may not have that dramatic an impact on how they're ranked after that interview happens. And so you can look at this across program. I include this table only just because we're a very diverse group in terms of our background. And so I wanted to provide across every field. So you can kind of quickly look and see for your field, the percent of program directors who thought this was an important factor in choosing who to interview, and the percent of program directors who thought this is important in choosing who to rank. You'll see there are a couple outliers in terms of programs, and we'll talk about why. Those are mostly programs that use standardized letters. And so the issue is really, these are becoming important, these are important. And so what are the issues with narrative letters that we might use? And so, across sort of the literature looking at letters of recommendation, we know there are really significant interpretation issues of letters. And a number of studies, and I'll give you sort of a long list of references near the end, there's relatively poor inter-rater reliability, that different readers may interpret different letters in different ways, depending on their own context. There's relatively poor correlation between the letter's global assessment and the global assessments found in the MISPE. There's relatively mixed data on the correlation between sort of letter writers' global assessment and residency performance. A few studies have found that letters can predict excellent or poor performance in residency, but not always. There's enormous potential for bias, especially in unstructured narrative letters of recommendation. And so we know this is true from assessment more globally, that bias may really impact the way that we view trainees. There's relatively limited information in the letter of recommendation specific literature about this, but I think we suspect that it's likely to be true. I think one of our few data sources was actually a study from the surgical literature, actually from just like 2 months ago, where they looked at chairs letters from male surgical chairs who were writing letters on behalf of applicants. And unfortunately, they found what you might have expected, which is when writing about male applicants, these chairs were more likely to highlight male applicants' technical skills. When writing about female applicants, they were more likely to highlight the female applicants' personality factors. And then when you sort of broke down by race, as sort of self-reported on ERAS, applicants who identified as Asian were much more likely to have academic superlatives listed, but were much less likely to have any description of their personality or personal characteristics. And so again, I think the reason we don't know much about bias in letters is that we haven't looked. I think we'll talk at the end about strategies maybe to mitigate this bias as we write. But I think this is going to be a really important question. What strategies more global do we have to sort of ameliorate the effects of bias in the way we write letters? Letters can be time consuming to write, which I probably don't need to tell you that. They can be time consuming to read, especially when they're very long. And then you sort of really suffer from the issue of recommendation inflation, that everyone is the best, everyone is the brightest, can really be a challenge in interpreting these narrative letters. And so I include this, which is, I'll read it to you and then I'll tell you where it's from. This is from a perspective piece written in the New England Journal of Medicine. So tonight I traveled to a wondrous place, a fantasy land of sugar plums and fairy tales. It is a land where everyone will make a fine physician, where people have excellent interpersonal skills and a good rapport with their peers. In this land, about 1/10 of the inhabitants are among the finest I've ever worked with. A full quarter are outstanding, and almost all are in the upper quarter. The letter of recommendation is a farce. Grades are almost useless and class standings are non-existent. Only the national board scores are left, and they are universally decried as an inaccurate measure of a candidate's ability. The present situation is intolerable and must be changed. So this feels thoroughly modern. This is from 1983. And so this isn't really necessarily a new problem. I feel like this could have been written like yesterday, I feel like, in terms of the way we think about evaluating applicants. And so what they're describing here is what we'll call sort of application inflation, or recommendation inflation, where everyone is the best and brightest, and how we sort of parse through to really determine who is and who isn't at the top. And so, well, why then? Having presented all the problems with narrative letters, why isn't this my last slide saying these are stupid, like we shouldn't do them anymore, end of talk, open for discussion for 45 minutes? And so the issue is that sort of the landscape of what we can use to evaluate residents is really shifting. And so this was a survey of internal medicine program directors from 2006 and asked them, letters weren't included, and asked them to rank and order the most important factors for how they select residents for their program. And so if you look at things they ranked, you can sort of see that, one was grades in preclinical courses. Almost every school has done away with those. Was grades in required clerkships, electives, honors grades. Many schools are moving towards pass-fail. It was things like class rank and AOA. Many schools are sort of removing ranks, removing code words from the MISPEs, eliminating AOA. It includes things like step 1, step 2 CS, now gone. And I think individually, these were all really good decisions and I think really well-intentioned, but has left us with relatively few things remaining to evaluate and compare residents. And so really we're left with step 2 CK, the reputation of the medical school, and research. And so for this reason, the sort of changing landscape has really sort of sparked a return interest to letters of recommendation and how to improve them. And so if you look at PubMed, at citations for letters of recommendation, really since 2010, there's been this resurgence in interest in published works, whether looking at standardized letters, the impact sort of a bias, how to interpret them. And so I think really trying to think with so few things at our disposal to compare applicants, how can we more readily use letters to help distinguish? And so that will sort of segue into sort of an innovation to try to sort of improve the interpretability of these letters, standardized letters of recommendation. And so the emergency medicine was the first field to really sort of jump into this in 1997. So this has been in EM for quite a while now. So they have the SLOs, a standardized letter of evaluation, or a standardized letter of recommendation. They've been introduced to variable degrees to ENT, orthopedics, surgery, dermatology, internal medicine, sort of my field. There's been sort of optional guidance to residency PDs about sort of ways to structure fellowship letters, and now guidance to chairs of medicine on how to structure chairs letters. And so slowly sort of becoming more and more incorporated. And most of them look relatively similar. And so this is sort of the components of the emergency medicine standardized letter. An electronic form, 4 sort of parts of it. So background info about the author, how well they know the applicant, and sort of information about the institution. Applicant characteristics scored as top third, middle third, or bottom third. A global assessment, top 10%, top third, middle third, lower third, and then ask how many letters these people have written in the last year. And then a very limited amount of space for written comments. So the idea is that this is really supposed to improve inter-rater reliability and readability and provide a more clear global assessment about applicants. And so when you look at fields that use standardized letters, PDs are much more likely to report thinking that letters are incredibly important. And so this is that same data from the NRMP survey, but only looking at emergency medicine program directors. And so when looking at who to interview, 97% said that the standardized letters or the letters of recommendation were valuable, and they rated it at 4.9 out of 5 by a wide margin, the most important factor. And so fields that have introduced standardized letters, their program directors find them to be really valuable and important in determining who to interview and who to rank. And so the question is, going back to the literature and the letter of recommendation field, how have these standardized letters fixed the problems we've already addressed? So I will say they have done a really good job at reducing inter-rater reliability. Every study looking at standardized letters that I could find found that standardized letters outperformed sort of narrative letters when it comes to inter-rater reliability. It hasn't really addressed any concerns about correlations. No studies have looked at that in particular. These letters are often faster to read. There have been a number of sort of funny studies where they like time people reading letters, either a standardized or a narrative. It's a little horrifying how fast people read letters. In one of the Derm papers, they found that program directors read letters of recommendation in 67 seconds. So it gives you a hint about how long our letters maybe should be if they're reading them in 67 seconds. But these standardized letters are faster to write and faster to read. Haven't really addressed anything about sort of the correlation between letter of recommendation data and residency performance. no clear guidance or information on whether they mitigate bias. I certainly would argue they probably do. Having a standardized format, reporting the same information about all candidates for whom you write a letter, I think is a really good and important strategy to reduce the impact of bias in letter writing, though we don't really have data to support that. And so feeling pretty good so far, at least mixed about standardized letters, the question is how do they do at corralling this recommendation inflation? And so regretfully, I will tell you it hasn't fixed that problem and it's perhaps even exacerbated it. And so this is looking at orthopedics standardized letters. And so this is the University of Southern California. During one interview cycle, they received 513 applicants who had standardized letters. There were only about 800 applicants that entire cycle, so they received around 65% of all candidates' applications during that cycle. And so when they looked at the letters they received, they found that 51% of these letters categorized applicants as being ranked to match, and an additional 40% said they were in the top third. And so you can sort of see, looking at this clearly, this is saying that 91% of orthopedics applicants are in the top third of all applicants, which is a problem. And so the conclusion of sort of this article was that measures to reduce inflation must be implemented or the form should be abandoned. Really widespread recommendation inflation that almost everyone was rated top third or better. Looking similar at emergency medicine, another similar study, 3 residency programs sort of combined all the standardized letters they'd received during one application cycle. And so in the top section where letter writers had to rank applicants' abilities in certain areas, they found that about 90% of applicants on any particular ability were ranked in at least the top third, and then more than half were in the top 10% of all applicants. And when you looked at their global assessment, 40% of all EM residents are ranked as being in the top 10, 83% are in the top 10 or top third. And so really significant inflation, though I see a couple of people sort of putting sort of dissenting viewpoints, which is great. I think, you know, across different disciplines, this may sort of react differently. When you look at residency applications, emergency medicine, orthopedics, ENT, derm, they've all seen significant issues with recommendation inflation, where individual letter writers are trying to advocate for their trainees, but at the expense of usable global data. And so our takeaways so far, sort of now 25 minutes in, so letters of recommendation are viewed as important across most disciplines, usually used more in determining who to interview than how to rank. There's issues with inter-rater reliability. There's massive recommendation inflation. Standardized letters may improve some features, but not all, and that faculty and PDs read letters very quickly. So having said that, what is our task? Our task in writing a letter is to write a letter that can be read within 1 to 2 minutes, is completely unambiguous, avoids bias, takes into account recommendation inflation, and makes a best possible case for a residency or fellowship program to invite the applicant for an interview. All right, not so bad. So now we need to figure out how we actually do that, how we achieve that, having sort of that appropriate context. And so let's think a little bit about what the data tells us about what makes for an effective letter, and then we'll synthesize all of that to think about what a framework would be for effective letter writing. And so, you know, to start, a few things that we can't change. Across all studies that I'm going to cite, and there are 5 or 6 very similar studies, I'll only cite 3 just for the sake of time. Things that matter across all of these studies: the reputation of the institution, the academic rank of the letter writer, and whether the reader of the letter knows the writer of the letter. So you are not likely to influence those things, at least in the short term. And so those are sort of non-modifiable. Things to avoid for sure across all studies: don't just recite CV elements, don't write anything negative or neutral. And then I think being very cautious about unintentional use of dean's letter code words. So many schools still rank their students, you know, outstanding or exceptional being first, excellent being second tier, very good being third, good being fourth. And so I think you have to be very cautious. That excellent sounds, well, excellent, but for almost every school in the country, for their dean's letter, excellent means they are second or third tier. And so I would be very careful about globally assessing a trainee as excellent unless you really mean that, because people may conflate those meanings together. And then some controversial things. I feel like until I started sort of looking into this more, I actually did this routinely. A number of studies found that explicitly stating a willingness to discuss a candidate on the phone was viewed as negative. That it was sort of like, saying like, there's more information if you really want it, but I'm not going to put it out there on this letter. And so I think that's a little bit controversial. I historically had done that, thinking I could advocate for sort of residents that way. I've sort of stopped doing that over time. And so looking at a few of these studies, what do they find matters when you survey different program directors? So one is the format. And so I think, a pretty standard recommendation for the structure is that paragraph 1 is an introduction, explaining how you know the applicant. The body is using sort of ascribing specific traits to the candidate, and then giving specific examples to support the existence of that attribute. And then the last paragraph sort of containing a global assessment. And this is basically the structure of all standardized letters. And so I'll highlight to you 3 studies that provide some useful information in terms of what letter writers want to see. So the first is a survey of courtship directors in internal medicine. So they were asked questions relating to rating, writing, and reading letters. A pretty robust response rate for a sort of big national survey. And so what did they find? They found that the most important feature by far for a letter writer to achieve is perceived depth of understanding of the applicant. And we're going to talk a lot in the next 10 minutes about different buzzwords, phrases, but every single study that has looked at this, but the first and most important thing is that you as a letter writer demonstrate a depth of understanding of the applicant. The biggest red flag cited in the literature, and I think from personal experience, is when people use sort of couching terms. As far as I'm aware, as far as I've seen, from what the residents have told me, when you distance yourself from the candidate, you are showing you don't have a depth of understanding, and therefore you are weakening the letter quite dramatically. And so I think we'll talk about some of these buzzwords, but I think, again, demonstrating that you know the applicant is really an essential feature of letters as compared to things like numeric comparisons, summary statements, and so forth. To highlight a second study from the pediatrics world, there was a 2018 survey of pediatrics residency and fellowship program directors. They were asked to rate different elements of letters of recommendation using 1 to 5 scales and a lower response rate, but otherwise a very well done study. And so first they asked these program directors, what features do they want to see in letters? And so this was whether they think these things were important or not. And so as you'll see, again, the most important thing to these pediatrics residency and fellowship program directors was demonstrating a depth of understanding or a depth of interaction with the applicant. They also really wanted specific traits and abilities for the applicant, and they wanted a summary statement on the strength of recommendation. Everything else was a little less clear whether they thought this was a positive or unnecessary component. Things like length, research, competency-based framework was less clear, less universal desire. But again, really demonstrating a depth of understanding, a depth of interaction, and then having specifics about traits and abilities. And so again, from the same group of program directors, what traits and abilities did they think were most positive? They found that most everything you could think of as being positive was, but across this group of program directors, work ethic, trustworthiness, being a team player, and being professional were perceived as the most essential characteristics for residents that these program directors wanted to recruit. Relatively similar findings across the fellowship program directors. We'll compare and contrast in just a moment with surgical PDs, and we'll see this list looks pretty similar across surgical disciplines as well. So last but not least, from this really great paper in JGME, was asking them their impressions of different statements within the letter of recommendation. And so anything with this sort of darker bar, that's more people rating this as being a positive. And so you can go from sort of the most positive to the least, which is I give my highest recommendation as sort of the highest and the best thing you can say. Wanting the applicant to stay at your institution or exceeding expectations, sort of narrowly behind. Highly recommend, a little bit below that. And then down at the bottom, things like performed at expected level, showed improvement, or solid performance, all things that are deemed to be either neutral or negative. So let's compare to the surgical fields, and then maybe we'll sort of synthesize a little bit to think about how we create a framework for writing letters. And so this was, again, a similar survey, this one done at the Mayo Clinic. It was a 35 question survey sent to surgical attendings at one institution. They asked to rate applicant characteristics and phrases on a 1 to 10 scale. And again, a relatively modest response rate, but otherwise a very well done study, though single institution. And so what do they find in terms of characteristics? The list looks largely the same. These surgical attendings who had a role in selecting surgeons for the various training programs at Mayo thought that a strong work ethic, being inquisitive, and being collaborative were kind of the three most important attributes, more important than things like openness to criticism, professionalism, leadership, and so forth. And so strong work ethic, inquisitive nature, collaborative, again, across both studies being relatively highly rated attributes by program directors. They similarly asked them to rate sort of different phrases in the letter. And again, you can see that certain phrases were again rated really highly. For this surgical group, saying that you plan to recruit this candidate or that you give them your highest recommendation were deemed as sort of the most valuable, the most positive statements, all the way down to things like meeting expectations or sort of like more banal descriptions of sort of like skills rather than sort of comparisons or recommendation statements. Okay, so where are we so far? And then how do we come up with this framework? And so again, our task, to repeat myself, write a letter that can be read in 1 to 2 minutes, unambiguous in its message, avoids bias, takes into account recommendation inflation, makes the best possible case for trainees to be invited for an interview. And we need in our letter to show a depth of knowledge of the applicant. We need to highlight specific traits and abilities of the applicant. Across multiple studies, things like strong work ethic, collaborative nature, inquisitive nature are rated very highly. And we want to sort of liberally use, when appropriate, phrases like highest recommendation, plan to recruit and want to stay type language, outstanding, or exceeded expectations. And so again, I highlighted 3 studies. There are 6 in total that did similar work. I think these findings are true across all 6, across sort of varied disciplines. And so let's move on to our last half, and we'll hopefully leave sort of 10 minutes, 15 minutes for questions and comments to rely on the expertise from the IME community about how we can collectively do better in this space. And so what does this framework look like? I think, before we even get into that, I did want to sort of mention again about our sort of individual and collective roles in reducing bias in letter writing. And so at the end, when we have questions and comments, I would love to hear from people about what their individual strategies are to mitigate any unconscious bias. For me, I think having a standardized and structured approach where sort of the framework of each letter is the same is really important. And then I think sort of, reflecting back on your letters. And so, through becoming interested in this, I've, looked back on every letter I've written in the last like 6-7 years. I've gotten a lot better over time. I don't think I picked up any evidence of bias, but I think being sort of honest and open to assessing your own letter writing is really important, because I think we may subtly sort of damage the chances of applicants, right? So from previous studies, we know that for female applicants, letter writers may be more likely to write about personality than skills, which may be interpreted by programs to mean an absence of skills when you don't intend that. For residents who are from backgrounds underrepresented in medicine, we may be really excited or interested in telling a story about challenges overcome, which to us may ring very positive. To programs, challenges overcome means they had challenges and maybe they aren't the best in the program. And so I think really great. I think Dr. Foreman sharing a link to a program, which I think I'll want to check out as well. Thanks for sharing. And so let's think about kind of the structure and framework. And again, many of you are very experienced here, so you may have your style already. So for me, I think really thinking critically about my own teaching roles and when students ask me to write letters. And so for me, like I, attend, a couple weeks a year in our inpatient sort of teaching rounds for medical students. It's not that I'm that great. It's just that like students don't have that many opportunities to find internists to write them letters. So every single IM candidate I've ever done rounds with has asked me for one. And so I kind of know that it's coming, and so I'm preparing myself already. And so for you, if there's a specific type of rotation or experience where you get asked to write letters, being aware, being mindful, start that process of taking some brief observations for later can be really helpful. Once you're asked to write a letter, the question really is, can you write them a strong letter? Given the degree of recommendation inflation, I think if you cannot write them a strong letter, we have the obligation as educators to say no. That may be uncomfortable, that may be hard, but it is important because when 99% of the letters are glowing, your sort of lukewarm letter will be damning. And so if you can't write that strong letter, you should say no. And then once a trainee asks me to write a letter, I quickly write down their name and field, when and where I interact with them, 2 to 3 core attributes or skills, and then sort of one specific example for each skill. And there may be a long gap from ask to writing. And so those specific skills, those specific examples are really important to write down in the moment so you remember them for later. And so in preparing to write the letter, so you need from the trainee their CV, draft or a personal statement, and then you want to find those things you jotted down about those specific characteristics and a few examples about each of them. Some people don't, but I think I might argue that you should meet with every trainee for whom you are going to write a letter, even if you have very recent or ongoing contact. You're going to want to ask them about what experiences are they particularly proud of that you can highlight, what attributes they want highlighted that will sort of like, create synergy with their own sort of self-presentation and their personal statement, any concerns they have, and then asking about preferred names and pronouns. I think it always is a little bit jarring when you have this letter from someone who says they know the applicant really well, and every single letter says Andy, 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 and then it's like Andrew, and you're like, who's this Andrew guy coming along? So you want to make sure you're using the name that they prefer to have in their application. And then I think if they have concerns, if they have potential red flags, thinking critically about whether you can assist them in that area, or you wanted to ignore with the hope that it doesn't sort of have more attention drawn to it. And so I will sort of block off an hour, may take less, don't want to take more. You're going to start the letter off with sort of a generic dear program director, dear admissions committee, something like that. And then the first paragraph should be an introduction. And so I would say, given that letter readers read letters in less than a minute in some cases, the first sentence should have a very strong endorsement and the degree of your recommendation. If true, you definitely want to include at least one of the highly rated phrases in that paragraph. So I'm delighted to give my highest recommendation to, or outstanding if you're writing a very strong letter. For me, every letter I write is not going to be the strongest possible letter, but sort of knowing what that strongest possible letter looks like, it becomes easier to take sort of steps down to like slightly less good. So like I highly recommend, or this excellent candidate. It gives you a sense of how to sort of step down a little bit once you know what that best possible letter looks like. Include how you know the applicant. And if you work with residents, students, other trainees in that discipline, frequently note that. If you don't, I would not highlight your inexperience. So highlight if you have lots of experience. If you don't, just leave it blank. So moving on to the body of the letter, spread over 1 to 3 paragraphs, you want to highlight attributes or abilities the trainee exemplifies. I would say you should reflect on the narrative in their personal statement. Is there anything you want to echo? If you're truly stumped, if you have lots of options because they're so great, I think strong work ethic, collaborative nature, or being inquisitive may be ideal choices of attributes to highlight, since those have been highly rated across all 6 studies in the literature, looking at what letter readers are looking for. Once you've chosen the attributes in the body, sort of 1 per paragraph, you need to label the trainee as having that attribute and then give examples that you have witnessed or examples from their CV. I would argue you should never give examples without assigning them to an attribute, and you should never assign an attribute without giving examples. So just giving examples of many things they've done, that's boring. They can just read the CV. Assigning them an attribute or a characteristic without giving examples opens things up to misinterpretation. So no matter how positive, there is some spin that someone can read it negatively, right? You may write that someone's incredibly hardworking and dedicated. Well, if you don't give examples of what you mean by that, someone may interpret that to mean, well, they're really hardworking and they kind of have middling grades. It must mean they're not very naturally talented, right? That's a stretch. Hopefully no one would read that into the letter. But if you're not giving specific examples, I think you open things up to misinterpretation. So give them an attribute and then give an example of how they demonstrate that attribute. That's your real contribution, the real value you provide as a letter writer. And then again, when describing attributes, you want to try to frame them as being beyond expectation if possible. So things like exceeded expectations, far above their peers, at the level of an intern compared with their peers. So you want to make those normative comparisons, if appropriate, to show that not only do they have an attribute and they've demonstrated it, they have it in sort of a greater quantity or quality than their peer comparison group. And then again, if there are red flags that will not go unnoticed, I would think about taking them head on. And I think for me, on a few occasions, I've had sort of honest discussions with applicants about this, saying basically like a program will notice that you failed step one. So like how can I help sort of contextualize that for them? How can I sort of help explain that struggle and sort of augment the argument you're going to make? And I think it can be hard if it's a very subtle failure or red flag. You don't want to call attention to it. But again, if it really is in that category of things that will not be missed by the program, failing the clerkship in question, failing a board exam, I would think about with the student, if they feel comfortable, how you can help address that through your letter and to help them get that foot in that door for the interview that they may not get otherwise. So moving to the last paragraph. So that should be our global assessment and our summary statement. And so the first sentence of the last paragraph should be relisting or a short summary of those core attributes from the body of the letter of recommendation. It should provide an assessment and or endorsement. And so considering things like outstanding, exceeded expectations. If you are in program leadership and you feel this is true, you should note that you want to recruit them. Every study has found that to be incredibly important, especially when the reader knows the writer of the letter. If you are not in program leadership, I think it's always fair to note that you're hoping they'll stay at the institution or that you'll be advocating for them to stay at the institution. And then again, you want to end by restating your level of recommendation. So again, bookending the letter with that sort of global statement and your level of recommendation. And so to me, the like strongest possible conclusion would be sort of this paragraph, which would be, applicant's name has shown herself to have clinical knowledge and skills that far exceeded expectations and an outstanding work ethic while demonstrating true empathy and compassion for her patients. She's one of the top students from our institution applying in internal medicine this year, and I would rank her in the top 5% of all students I have worked with in the clinic. We will be recruiting her to stay and continue her training here at Mount Sinai, but I'm certain she will excel in any training program she chooses. Therefore, I give applicant's name my highest possible recommendation for your training program. And so to me, that would be sort of the strongest possible endorsement. And I think if you've written fewer letters, I think understanding what your best possible letter looks like helps you modulate a little bit down if you feel like they're very strong, but perhaps not the best you've ever seen. So finalizing the letter, I think the ideal length is about a page. Again, from all the days we have, people read these letters in 60 to like 90 seconds on average. And so the longer it is, the more your message will get lost. Because of that, you want to include sort of core endorsements and recommendations in the first and last paragraph because people may be skimming, and then include your professional titles or roles at the bottom. You need to proofread beyond just spell check, proofread. If you use templates or you're starting from a previously written letter, triple check the name and gender pronouns. For the internal medicine residency program, I would say 3 to 5 times every year, we see a letter where the gender changes halfway through or the name changes halfway through. So that is a huge red flag because I don't know that I can trust the recommendation when you're not even sure who you're writing it about. So don't make that mistake. That will be viewed as very negative for the program. I think Dr. Foreman's example, have someone else proofread, I think is an excellent idea. If you're in a program where you have sort of multiple APDs, core faculty, have other people look at it to make sure you're not missing something as obvious as the wrong name or as subtle as errors, bias, etc. Print, sign, scan to PDF. And then for those who haven't done this before, for ERAS, you'll upload to their letter of recommendation portal. And so thinking a little bit about sort of these issues and how we sort of address them before we open up for a little bit of discussion. So again, narrative letters have significant issues with interpretation and inter-rater reliability. And so you must use clear and unambiguous language. And so again, use the evidence-based phrases I reviewed today so that all faculty reading the letter come to the same conclusion. And again, I think the value of assigning an attribute to a trainee and then giving examples is that that attribute will not be sort of misunderstood. If you're saying they're hardworking and then you give the example of how they finished rounds early or like saw extra patients or like created some new workflow for your clinic, like people will understand it to be a positive. It becomes unambiguous because you've given clear examples. We know that letters are time consuming to write and to read. And so again, be sure to use these core keywords, phrases in the first paragraph with your statement of recommendation and in the last. Many letter readers will read very quickly, will read the beginning and the end, and so include those there. I think bolding can be helpful in very small quantities. So if your whole letter is bold, nothing is in bold. But if like one word, if I see like top 1% in bold, like great. Like now I have a very clear sense of their global assessment. And then, recommendation inflation. I think something that we didn't talk about today, or I didn't at least, but I'd love to hear from you is, our role as educators. And so I think, what is the future of letter of recommendation writing? I think it's going to be a transition across most fields towards standardized letters as an attempt to improve interpretability and reduce bias. But that's needing to be paired with fixing this collective action problem of recommendation inflation. But I think we would all be better off if we could be honest about trainees, that not all are the best, not all will excel without support. And so being able to be honest and open about the support that someone will need to truly live up to their potential would make all of us better off in medicine. But right now, we do not live in that world. And so right now, if you are honest, you will probably be one of the few people who's not engaging in recommendation inflation. And so you will seriously damage their chances. And so I think as mentors, we need to sort of understand recommendation inflation. As educators, we can try to fix it. But I think fixing it by sabotaging one individual student is not going to be helpful. Yeah, I think for running for residence, someone asked, is it better to use first name or doctor? I would mix it up. I think my concern would be if it's all sort of doctor whoever, I think it may come across as overly formal and that you don't really have that depth of understanding. I tend to use both as well, just so it's showing that I actually know them as a person. And so sort of concluding, I'm going to open it up for questions. So letters are important, again, more to determine who to interview than how to determine who ranks highly. Demonstrating that the applicant is crucial, use those specific phrases, and then again, highlight those particular traits that have been proven across multiple studies to be really important to program directors. And so I think Olga will send out the slides along with the handout. So the sort of end of the slides has a couple of general references that I think are quite helpful for those who are a little more novice in writing letters. And those from particular fields, I've broken down sort of all of the published work by field. And so surgery, ortho, plastics, et cetera. You can see what's written in your particular field about letters of recommendation. And so maybe with that, in the last kind of 12 minutes, I'll open up to questions. Beyond questions, I would also love to hear from people about their own personal strategies, their own personal bias mitigation strategies, and any thoughts you might have on our role as an educational field to rein in recommendation inflation.
Thank you, Andy, so much. And maybe I'll ask you to minimize, Andy, your screen. That was outstanding. And to open it up for questions. I know Andy has shared so much, and I'm sure people have questions or comments. And please, if you don't mind raising your hand for me so that I can see you and can call on you. Dr. Satcher, go ahead.